Welcome back to Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. Today we have Marco Cesar Lizárraga, and he is an immigrant in the United States, but he is a long-time immigrant. He came to the US in 1958, and he's going to speak with us a lot about immigration in the United States and farm-related immigration. Marco leads an organization for migrant workers in the US. So stay tuned to hear our conversation. Marco, how are you?
So far, so good. Thank you. Staying safe.
Yeah, Marco, tell us a little bit about your organization and tell us what do you know, your opinions about immigration to farms with farm related work in the old years and in recent years.
Okay, a little bit about the organization. The organization is called La Cooperativa Campesina de California. Now, this is an association of 5 organizations that cover the whole state of California. All these organizations came out of the original war on poverty in 1968. And they eventually evolved into specializing in farm worker programs. And that agency at the federal level was split and given the farm worker programs to the Department of Labor. In California, they became organized. There used to be about 12. Eventually, there were only 5. They became organized and formed the organization to which I belong, which was an association of them to gain a little bit of more political force. Obviously, the focus was and is the farm worker in the United States, well, especially in California for us. And the federal government has designated these 5 members of my organization as the National Job Farm Workers Programs grantees who operate those programs for the state of California. Uh, so I've been doing that, having been a farm worker myself as a kid. My parents, were in the fields, and that's where my dad died. It was a natural for me to want to work helping my people.
What
Uh,
crops have you worked on those
when
beginnings?
I, yeah, when I worked at that time. Cotton was king. You got to remember that I've been around for many decades. So, in the decades when I was a kid, at 12, 13 years old, cotton was the white gold at that time. Of course, I worked on the cantaloupes. I worked a lot picking grapes. I worked on the peaches. I worked on the watermelons, uh, onions, garlic, and of course, weeding and doing all kinds of things until I was about 17.
Mhm.
So, what was my next topic? Um,
Yes, immigration in the US.
Yeah, it's immigration. I have seen decades of immigration and have the fortune of having come to the United States when it was relatively easy. And it was relatively easy to come. I remember my dad became a green carder, immigrated. And within 1 year, my grandmother, my mom, and I were immigrated to come with them. It was relatively easy. As time passed, it became more difficult. And I recall it very clearly because I was very involved also in 1986 with what we call the IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act. That came under President Reagan at that time. And I was very involved in legalizing a lot of the farm workers at that time. I worked with hundreds of them to get them papers to become eventually citizens, hopefully, or at least permanent residents.
Mhm.
Um, from then on, we've seen a very negative wave on immigration.
Mhm.
And while objectively speaking, a country like the United States is in dire need of immigrants, the trend has been to curtail immigrants, so that immigration has become a way of filtering people out rather than bringing people in.
Mhm.
If, for instance, to cross the border in Mexico today, well, it was easy for us back in 1958. Today it can be a very dangerous proposition, uh,
Mhm.
where many of our people die in the deserts, crossing on foot or in the mountains.
Mhm.
And so it has changed quite a bit. And as I told a group of legislators a few years ago, about 3, 4 years ago, that we were really facing a sort of an elephant that has always existed in the United States. It was
Mhm.
really the agricultural industry that brought us slavery. It was for the agricultural industry way back in the 1800s. Today, it is still the same elephant that is maintaining immigration where we is and driving it to where we are, because
Mhm.
essentially what they're looking for is a form of legalizing foreign workers that don't have to stay in this country.
Mhm.
And that has been their main effort. They have gotten partially some of it in the new immigration bill. You want me to, can I jump into that now?
Yeah.
Okay. The new immigration bill, which is called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act,
Mhm.
they sort of were satisfied enough with the expansion and the new rules for the what they call the H-2A program, which allows them to contract thousands of workers from Mexico to come and work here.
Mhm.
Our concern has always been the treatment and whether the labor laws are going to be applied to them, and that the housing there's provided to them, is provided to them as required by law. They got a modification under the Workforce Modernization Act to do it quite a bit the way they wanted to do it. And
Mhm.
we were satisfied enough that it still allowed some monitoring and supervision of it. We
Mhm.
have had very many cases of abuses, and they have been dealt with. On the other hand, I'm not going to lie. For instance, there was one big grower in the Salinas Valley who built a almost a beautiful housing project for their workers.
Mhm.
We wish that they would all do that. So
Yeah.
that's where we are on the immigration today. It has become a filtering rather than a welcoming.
Well, tell us a little bit how does that legal workers, how exactly it happens with the H-2A programs? Because some employers complain about it and some employees complain about it because you have to participate, let's say, in a harvest, and then you have to come back to your own country. So tell us how does that work in
But what
reality?
about, yeah, it has, of course, it has room for everybody to be unhappy, and it has room for a lot of people to be, satisfied. As far as the worker is concerned, most of them are satisfied. There's a lot of them, like I said, that have been abused. There was one case where we had that it was over $400,000 had to be paid to them because they were not paid their regular wages. On
Mhm.
the side of the grower, of course, they want the flexibility, and they need an easier process to be able to contract the people here. But of course, you have two ends. You have the end of Mexico, where there's a lot of contractors that, through corrupt practices, abuse the contracting of the workers, and
Mhm.
as they work with growers on this side. Now, on this side, it's mostly not done directly by growers, it's done by contractors.
Mhm.
They are the ones that contract and then place the workers with farmers. And of course, today, the farming industry is not an industry of farmers, but of farming companies.
Mhm.
The fields in the country have been sort of taken to a level of a production center, like a factory.
Mhm.
In fact, if I may introduce this is what allowed Cesar Chavez to be able to organize workers in this industry, because they were thinking more like workers, not like farmers.
Yes.
And so that right now, for like I said, the farmer does need some flexibility with their workers and make it easier for them to hire. As much as some of us have opposed it, it's almost we cannot be successful. All we can do is look for ways that the program does not hurt the farm worker that is brought here, because we've got to be objective. Uh, that labor force is needed in this country. In California, for instance, you're talking about a $50 billion industry. And of
Hmm.
course, it's also a program that is needed by Mexico because of what we call they call the visas or the remesas, all the
Hmm.
money, billions of dollars that is sent to Mexico from the Mexicans here in the United States, for instance, is second
Hmm.
only to tourism in terms of revenues for Mexico. So obviously, both countries are going to be very supportive of it. So what we are espousing and asking is that it be done in such a way where the worker is protected.
Yes. And what about illegal or undocumented workers?
Okay.
What's the reality that you see regarding
Okay.
them?
In the case of California, okay, while the official record of the Employment Development Department is about 452,000 farm workers, what agricultural specialists and economists that do studies, especially in UC Davis, tell us that's about 800,000 farm workers,
Hmm.
okay? Because of the seasonality of it. And so, and the farmers and the farm industry exception, they claim that there's about 800,000 farm workers. Now,
Undocumented workers.
out of those 800,000, they claim to have at least 60%
Hmm.
that are not documented. They are
Hmm.
undocumented. They
Okay.
are very vulnerable because they're not subject to any unemployment benefits. They're not subject to any health benefits, to any benefits of any kind. So
Hmm.
they are a very vulnerable working force, especially in California, in the whole United States. But I'm much more familiar with the ones in California.
Yes. And I was going to ask you exactly about that. What's the big difference comparing each state for farm workers?
Comparing each what
State.
we are, and of course, I live in California, so it's easy for me to praise the state where I live. But I think it is a very well known fact throughout the world that California is a very progressive state. In California, for instance, we had it was the center of the farm worker movement under Cesar Chavez. So we've been able to get a lot of rights, like, for instance, unemployment for the farm worker. We've been able to get finally what we call the 840 hours. In other words, in agriculture, before you could earn overtime, you had to work 10 hours. But
Mhm.
for every other worker, it was only 8 hours. Okay.
Yes.
But of course, the farm worker was fortunate in California because in other states, they don't get overtime. But
Mhm.
now we even managed to get a law passed where the farm worker gets overtime after 8 hours or 40 hours in the week. So, given California's progressivity and the very progressive government that we have, there's a lot of benefits. They are also included on a minimum wage that within a year is going to be going up to $15 an hour. In
Mhm.
other states, especially in the more conservative southern states, they don't have workers' comp like we do in California. They don't have overtime. They don't have a lot of the requirements by the OSHA, what we call OSHA here, so that facilities are provided for them. In California, for instance, it's illegal for a farmer not to provide a shade in the field where they can go and eat under the shade or rest.
Mhm.
Okay, all those things do not exist in other states of the union, which is very unfortunate, and it leads to a lot of abuses and a lot of suffering by the farm workers.
Yes, and what have you seen as a change in the last few years?
One of the biggest changes, like I mentioned, and I started with that, was the fact that they in California now they can get overtime
Mm-hmm,
after 8 hours, and
mm-hmm,
that the minimum wage that is going to apply to the workers in California also applies to the farm worker.
mm-hmm,
So that minimum wage will go up to about $15 in another year, I think, and that's a huge change.
mm-hmm,
Um, Today, for instance, the governor in California just put out about 500 to possibly $1,000 of cash to provide the undocumented worker what we're going through the COVID-19 crisis.
mm-hmm.
So, but the minimum wage, the working 8 hours, and the minimum wage is one of the biggest things that has occurred because since I was in school, we were fighting for that. We
Mm-hmm.
finally got it.
And so, in your opinion, the relationship between farm owners and the workers has improved over the years?
The relationships with the farm industry and the workers.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't give credit to what the farming industry has also done, and reluctantly, but they have collaborated and they have acceded to a lot of these changes. They may not like it, but they've been good enough to go with it and provide as much as they can. Like I mentioned, there is one interesting case, an anecdote that, if I may, I'll tell you. In
Mm-hmm,
Salinas, of course, they were supposed to provide housing for the H2A. Well,
mm-hmm,
this company, farming company in Salinas,
mm-hmm,
provided a housing, complex that was really nice.
mm-hmm,
Well, not, they did that for the H2A workers, but before they knew it, in 1 year, they had so many other workers from the south part of California and other states that wanted to work with them because
mm-hmm,
they had housing
mm-hmm.
that they have mostly now local farm workers on that housing instead of H2A workers who come from Mexico. And that was interesting because it really showed that if the farm worker, the national farm worker, is provided with adequate wages and housing, you'll have them. You'll have the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And what about the COVID-19 consequences for farm workers?
That has been really sad. It has been sad because when we talk about farm workers in the state of California, you're talking about mostly Mexican and Central Americans, and mostly Mexicans and Mexican Indians, indigenous people that have come to us, our brothers that have come from Mexico also that are
Mm-hmm,
indigenous. They have been very hit very hard. One of the first declarations that the federal government did was to declare that work an essential worker.
mm-hmm,
That meant they could not stay home. Of
mm-hmm.
course, even if they wanted to, they cannot afford to stay home. But the
Yes.
fact that the industry wanted them working and they kept them working has put them in a very vulnerable situation for catching the infection. It is very difficult to transport a bus of people with
Mm-hmm.
only 10 people when you can put 60 and then have to make different trips. So they are close by. And then when you work in the fields, it's very difficult to avoid each other as you're working out in the field, between the rows. Well, I've seen some efforts, okay, they are not quite successful. When they gather to get picked up, they are gathered, in groups. The second aspect of it is that there has been, contractors and people that have not abided by the requirements of providing masks, of providing things like that. So, for instance, I myself in our organization, we have provided thousands of masks directly to farm workers, and I'm in
Mm-hmm.
the process of distributing another 50,000, and I
Mm-hmm.
send my people out to the fields to give them direct to farm workers. Because one of the things that the state has required, a lot of things, distancing, and the masks, are required now. But there's no enforcement out in the fields. There's
Mhm.
nobody going out there to make sure that they are, watching the distance between people that they're watching. So consequently, we have in areas, and because they're Latinos, the Latino is the one that is suffering greatly the coronavirus. We have, one study that was done in San Francisco. Um, the Latinos that were tested in San Francisco were only 44%. The positive tests of those people were 95% Latinos.
Mhm.
So the same thing is occurring in the fields. We have in Sonoma County, 3 out of 4 infections countywide are Latino population, which mostly work out in the fields. So that has really spread. We just had a report of 188 out of 216 workers in the area of Oxnard in one living complex that
Mhm.
resulted infected. So it is hitting us very hard, very hard. And of course, the undocumented suffers the most because they have no access to unemployment benefits, no access to medical services, even though there's a lot of clinics and churches that are going out there and trying to provide those services. They are afraid to come out. And
Mhm.
even a lot of our, permanent residents, field workers, are afraid to come out because there was a law passed called the public charge. And if you have gotten government assistance, then you are not allowed to become citizen.
Mhm.
So a lot of them, even though they have, a permanent status, are afraid to go for services on top of everything else. So that's making it really bad.
Yes, but compared to other immigrants, the farm worker has an advantage right now because it is considered an essential activity. So the other visas were halted by the Trump administration.
Yeah. Well, one of the complaints that we have, and it is a complaint, it's fine. If we are going to consider them essential, then we should consider them valuable
Yeah.
and protect them.
Hmm.
And that is where it's lacking. That protection is not quite there as it should be for somebody that's an essential worker. And I think that one of the things that the government needs to realize is, yes, they are essential. Yes, they are providing the food, but a sick workforce is not going to be able to do that.
Hmm.
So that one aspect I think is lacking, and we definitely are making an issue out of it, and trying to get the government to um, ensure that they are protected adequately, being that they are essential, and they are essential.
Yeah.
There was one of the positive things of this is that they finally realized how essential the farm worker is.
Yes. We spoke to Marco Cesar Lizárraga. Thank you, Marco. Is there something else would you like to add?
All I would add is, thank you, Luis, for interviewing me and giving me the opportunity to put out some of the feelings that we have and some of the struggles that we have. And just to say that, some of us that came from the farm worker population are not going to give up. That's one thing we're never going to do.
Congratulations. We appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.